My name is Elena Vance, and I am 29 years old. 11 years ago, exactly 3 days before my 18th birthday. My parents canceled my celebration because my older sister wept, claiming it made her feel insignificant. I packed up and walked out that very night. 2 canvas duffel bags, a copper tea canister stuffed with $1,200, and a call to the only adult who had ever paid me fairly. What took place a year later at my grandmother's 80th birthday, right in the center of a lavender field I had planted with my own 2 hands, is the one chapter my family still refuses to whisper aloud. My sister stood in that purple field, stared at the life I had carved out, and completely shattered in front of 30 relatives. The aftermath split our family clean down the middle, a fracture that never healed. But here is the truth none of them ever grasped. I wasn't the one who broke us. I simply stopped holding the fragments together. Welcome back to their secret stories, where women who were taught to shrink themselves finally tell the truth, quietly and all the way to the end. If you have ever been the sister who was expected to be fine on her own, this story is for you. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments below. Drop your city and time, and make sure to subscribe, because you will want to be there when we reach that field. To understand that birthday, you have to understand our home. Our household operated like a trauma ward. Whoever screamed the loudest received the entire cure. The funds, the focus. Both parents hovering at once, and my sister, Vivienne, was always screaming loudest. I was barely 7 when I figured out the equation. My 2nd grade piano recital landed on the same evening Vivienne, then 10, developed a sudden migraine that miraculously cleared by 9 o'clock. No one sat in the auditorium to hear me play. My mother explained it on the drive back, her voice patient, like a bank teller counting out small change. Your sister needed us tonight, sweetie. You did beautifully, I'm sure of it. When I was 12, I saved up my own birthday money to buy white leather riding boots, only for them to become shared family property the very week Vivienne decided her own boots pinched her toes. When my teachers sent home glowing reports, my mother rephrased the praise before it could even touch the dinner table. It became quieter, smaller, something not to be dwelt upon. Dwelling was a luxury reserved solely for Vivienne. I want to be entirely fair here, because fairness is the foundation of this story. My parents were never physically abusive. I was fed, I was clothed, and I was driven to school. But in the Vance household, being fine wasn't a state of mind. It was a full-time job assignment. I was hired at 7 years old and never granted a single day of vacation. The only person who saw the mathematics of it was my father. He would occasionally catch my eye across the wreckage of another ruined weekend, giving a small, weary nod, like a captain observing a storm he had absolutely no intention of steering out of. The summer I turned 15. He found me pruning grandmother, Martha's lavender rose, and muttered out of nowhere, 18 is yours, kid. Whatever you want. I promise. I planted that promise deeper than any seed I ever put in the soil. That was my true mistake. It took 3 long years to blossom into the coldest night of my life. You have to understand my sister, too, because this story isn't entirely fair to her either, just in a different light. Vivienne was 21 that autumn. 3 years my senior. She had already enrolled in and subsequently fled 2 different universities. Each departure followed the exact same script: a frantic midnight phone call, an existential crisis, and my mother mobilizing like a specialized task force. Nobody in our house ever used the word failure. Vivienne was insufficiently supported. Vivienne was more deeply sensitive than ordinary people. Every collapse was carefully rebranded until it sounded like a medical diagnosis. And every diagnosis arrived with a heavy invoice my parents were deeply honored to settle. Here is what I only realized years down the line. They engineered her that way. From her infancy, Vivienne was taught that she was made of glass. So, glass is exactly what she became. Needing rescue became her entire personality, just as not needing anyone became mine. Our roles were cast long before we could even speak. The clearest illustration of this dynamic is the night of my regional horticulture banquet during the spring I turned 16. I had won a county-wide award for a vertical irrigation system I had designed entirely on my own. It was the first time I was ever publicly recognized for a talent. My parents actually showed up, which stunned me. But then Vivienne called from a diner parking lot, weeping over an argument with a boyfriend, and our dinner ended before the first trophy was even polished. I rode home in the back seat with my ribbon sitting heavy in my lap. In the kitchen, Vivienne caught sight of the ribbon, and her face fell as if I had struck her. "Tonight was absolute hell," she whispered, "and you're standing there holding a prize." This was supposed to be about me. She said it with the absolute certainty of someone citing a municipal code, because in our household, it was one. My mother immediately brewed her chamomile tea. No one ever asked to look at my ribbon. I pinned it to the inside of my closet door, where everything that truly belonged to me had to reside. What ultimately saved me was the soil. At 14, I began spending my weekends at thorn nurseries on the southern edge of town, hauling heavy flats of soil and scrubbing clay pots for Maeve Thorne. Maeve was 65, built like an iron spade and fundamentally incapable of empty praise. She paid me in cash blunt corrections and dry wisdom, which meant she gave me far more than my family ever had. By 17, I could manage her propagation house entirely on my own. Every single paycheck went straight into a savings account at Blackwood National Bank. By that September, I had accumulated $8,750, 3 solid years of Saturdays. But one crucial detail existed. Because I had opened the account at 14, the bank required an adult signature. It was a joint account with my mother. At 17, I went to the branch to ask about splitting it. The teller informed me I would need a parent to sign off on the transfer until I reached 18. My mother simply smiled and said, "Right after your birthday, darling. One step at a time." She repeated that same line in May, then again in July. I noticed. I want to make that very clear, I noticed. So I began quietly skimming my own earnings, cashing out small sums, $20 here, $50 there, slipping the folded paper bills into an old copper tea canister hidden deep behind my winter hiking boots. By September, that canister held $1,200. I kept telling myself I was merely being paranoid, that mothers do not require constant surveillance. Looking back, I wasn't paranoid. I was just incredibly slow. The rest of my savings remained exactly where they were, because a 17-year-old cannot override a maternal co-signature. And because some naive part of me still believed that joint account was a shared sanctuary rather than what it truly was, a plot of land, in someone else's name, farmed entirely by my sweat. The gathering I envisioned wasn't much of a party by typical standards. Dinner in Grandmother Martha's apple orchard. Strands of warm fairy lights woven through the ancient oak. A simple vanilla bean cake with raspberry cream filling from Blackwood Bakery, with my name written in pale lavender icing. 12 people, some wooden folding chairs, and Maeve Thorne, who had grumbled but promised to show up. That was the entirety of my dream. One quiet evening, one single table, and everyone's gaze directed toward the same spot for once, and that spot being me. My father had promised me this day. For 3 years, I had carried his promise around like a rare seed packet, constantly checking the expiration date. 18 was also a gateway. I had been accepted into the state university's advanced agricultural programs starting in the spring, and beyond that, blurry but unmistakable, lay the only life I wanted, a boutique-cut flower estate with my own name painted on the gate. It was grandmother Martha who had planted that vision in my mind. She grew rare, deep indigo irises behind her cottage on Elm Street, a resilient heritage strain her family had preserved since the year my father was born. The petals were so intensely dark they looked like velvet absorbing the late afternoon sun. That August, she walked me along her rows, touched a heavy bloom, and said, "A flower never apologizes for taking up space in a garden bed, Elena." Did you know that? I did. I realized it the way you notice a door left slightly ajar. Then, 3 weeks before my birthday, Vivienne announced her third attempt at higher education, an exclusive culinary and interior styling academy in Portland. It was highly competitive, she claimed, and required a massive non-refundable deposit immediately, or her slot would go to someone whose parents actually supported their dreams. I remember the exact tile I was standing on in the kitchen when she said it, because the room went dead silent in a way I had spent my entire childhood learning to interpret. In our house, silence was the distinct sound of capital changing course. Vivienne lasted exactly 11 days in Portland, 4 days before my birthday. On a cold Friday night, she arrived home at 1 a.m. I heard the heavy front door slam, followed by that precise frequency of her weeping. The kind that meant every piece of furniture in our lives was about to be rearranged to cushion her fall. By breakfast, the house had shifted on its axis. My mother moved through the rooms like a chief of surgery, murmuring hushed instructions into her phone. My father sat at the table, staring deeply into his black coffee. Vivienne occupied the center of the living room sofa, cocooned in our family's finest wool throw, detailing the unbearable cruelty of Portland to anyone who dared walk past. I toasted my bread and said absolutely nothing, which was my designated role. That evening I overheard my mother in the hallway speaking to Aunt Helen, my father's sister. Her voice carried her trademark tactical tone, low, smooth, and perfectly measured. It was the tone she used when tailoring a family disaster for public consumption. I caught the words, "We have to do what is best for the collective right now." And then came the smaller, sharper phrase that followed, aimed directly at me without ever uttering my name. Besides, she has her entire life ahead of her for celebrations. I stood in my bedroom holding a small stack of paper invitations I had hand-lettered myself, because we had never quite gotten around to mailing them. Perhaps because some deeper instinct had warned me never to make my hopes official. 12 envelopes, each decorated with a tiny sketch of an iris. I placed them face down in my desk drawer and tried to convince myself that the arithmetic could still balance. Surely, even in our family's perpetual emergency room, a daughter turning 18 was an event that outweighed a temporary bout of homesickness. The following morning, Saturday, my mother knocked softly on my door holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. She had her softest, most maternal tone turned up, and before she even opened her mouth, I knew precisely which promise was about to be clawed back. She sat on the edge of my mattress, arranging her features into an expression of tender sympathy. "Sweetheart, about Tuesday, Tuesday." Just like that, my 18th birthday had been demoted to a mere day of the week. "Your father and I have been talking. With everything your sister is struggling through right now, holding a celebration would feel like throwing salt in an open wound. If she sees you celebrating while her entire world is upside down, honey, it would absolutely crush her." I asked her what exactly they proposed we do instead. "We'll postpone it," she said, her voice as bright as a store coupon, "just until Vivienne gets back on her feet. We will do something small and intimate later. Just the family. Later. In the Vance household. Later. Was the graveyard where my dreams were quietly buried." I stared at her, and for the first time in my life, I bypassed the usual script. I asked the forbidden question. "When exactly is my turn scheduled on the family calendar, Mom? I'd really love to see the dates." Her face tightened for a fraction of a second, then smoothed out as she delivered the line that has echoed in my mind for 11 years. "Oh, Elena, please don't be so dramatic. You have always been perfectly fine on your own." And there it was, the foundational law of our family spoken aloud at last. Being low maintenance was my mandatory tax, the fee I paid so the rest of the household could remain in balance. Behind her, my father materialized in the doorframe. And this is the memory that cut the deepest, lasting longer than any of the anger. He looked at me, and I saw that he remembered. 18 is yours, kid. I promise." He placed one heavy hand on the wooden frame, opened his mouth to speak, and then Vivienne's voice drifted up from downstairs, damp and demanding. The doorway was empty. 30 seconds, maybe less. That is exactly how long it takes a 3-year-old promise to evaporate into thin air. My mother patted my knee on her way out. "You'll understand when you have a sensitive child of your own," she whispered. I sat in the silence after they left, listening to the house downstairs realign its entire structure to support my sister. I didn't scream, and I didn't plead. If you have ever been the strong child, you know exactly why we have had too much practice. What I did was open my laptop and check the balance on a savings account. Then, that very evening, the local bakery called to confirm. The young woman from Blackwood Bakery was calling to verify a change of order details on invoice 72. I told her I hadn't authorized any changes. She read the updated ticket to me anyway, her voice cheerful and entirely oblivious to the impact of her words. Same vanilla bean cake, new pickup date on Saturday, and a brand new inscription. They had taken my chocolate raspberry cake, the one I had selected back in June, and scraped my name entirely off the order ticket. It now read, "Welcome home, Vivienne." There was going to be an encouragement dinner the following Saturday evening. 4 days after my actual birthday would have passed in total silence, and the guest list, as I would later discover, matched my own invitations almost name for name. The same aunts, the same cousins, the same wooden folding chairs. My celebration hadn't been postponed. It had been harvested for raw materials. I thanked the bakery clerk, because none of this was her doing, hung up the phone, and stood in the center of my bedroom while something inside my chest went completely still and level, like a harvested field after the winter frost. People often assume life-altering decisions are forged in fire. Mine wasn't. It arrived the way a hard frost does, under a clear sky with no wind, leaving everything simply finished growing. I pulled my 2 canvas duffel bags down from the top shelf of my closet. I packed my heaviest work clothes, my sturdiest boots, the regional horticulture ribbon from the back of my closet door, and the 12 hand-written invitations I had never sent. I reached behind my winter hiking boots, pulled out the old copper tea canister, and counted the cash by touch alone. Then, sitting on the edge of my mattress, I placed a call to the only adult who had ever paid me fairly and on schedule. Maeve Thorne listened to me for about 10 seconds. "The apartment above the tool shed has a cot in it," she said. "It's drafty, the rent is $50 a month, and you'll earn your keep before the sun comes up. Come over. Or don't. My 18th birthday was still 3 days away. I didn't wait for it. I walked out that very night." Slipping away from the house you grew up in takes about 4 minutes, when you've been mentally packing your bags your entire life without realizing it. I walked down the wooden stairs with a heavy duffel slung over each shoulder. My mother was sitting at the kitchen island with her mug of tea. She stared at my luggage, then looked up at me, choosing mild irritation over any real concern. "For heaven's sake, Elena, don't be so theatrical. Where on earth do you think you're going?" I told her I had an early shift at the nursery, which was the literal truth, and left the rest unsaid. Vivienne watched me from the living room sofa, the wool throw pulled up to her chin. For a fraction of a second, an expression crossed her face that looked remarkably like jealousy. Jealousy of the bags, of the open door, of a person who actually had the strength to walk out. My father followed me out onto the front porch. He pressed a folded paper envelope into my palm. It contained $80 in worn, crumpled 5s and 10s, the secret savings of a man who had been quietly emptying his pockets into a desk drawer for a very long time. "Call your grandmother on Sundays," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the driveway. "She'll worry." He didn't ask me to stay. We both stood in the heavy silence of what he wasn't saying. I walked the 2 miles to Thorn Nurseries under a September sky that was the color of a bruised plum. When I unlocked the heavy door to the propagation house, the warm, rich scent of damp earth met me like a welcoming embrace. The loft above the tool shed was drafty, exactly as Maeve had promised. I lay down on the narrow cot and finally understood a truth I had been dancing around for years. Being low maintenance was the rent I paid to inhabit that family's house. That night I stopped paying. 3 days later, I spent my 18th birthday eating a grocery store muffin with a single candle Maeve had stuck in the center, looking deeply embarrassed by her own rare display of sentiment. On Wednesday morning, I walked into the bank to claim my 3 years of Saturdays, and that was when the teller's expression shifted. I had come in to set up a brand new, independent account, finally free of any co-signer requirements, and transfer my hard-earned savings into it. The teller brought up the joint account, and her polite customer service smile did that fragile, freezing thing when the computer screen contradicts the person standing across the counter. The balance on the screen was exactly $912. $8,000 had been withdrawn 3 weeks prior, precisely around the date Vivienne's exclusive Portland Styling Academy had demanded its non-refundable deposit. Every delay, every stalling tactic made perfect sense in an instant. Right after your birthday, darling, one step at a time. My mother hadn't been too busy to co-sign my paperwork. She had simply been keeping the gate wide open until she was finished harvesting the crop. And here is the detail I want every single listener to sit with. What she did was entirely legal. A joint account legally belongs to both parties listed on it. She hadn't stolen a single cent in the eyes of the law. She had simply spent my 3 years of Saturdays on an academy my sister abandoned after 11 days. I called her from the bank parking lot, my hands shaking. She didn't even hesitate. Family resources go where the family needs them most, Elena. Your sister's entire future was hanging in the balance. You are young and you are resilient. You will earn that money back in no time. Then her voice softened, like a tip left on a diner table. This is simply what families do. I walked back into the lobby, withdrew the remaining $912, and closed the joint account with perfectly steady hands. I waited until I was sitting inside the old flatbed truck Maeve had let me borrow before I allowed my knees to shake. By Sunday, my mother had already distributed her own version of the narrative to our entire extended family. The canceled birthday, the packed bags, the closed account. I learned all of it from a single voicemail. It seemed I had been cast as the villain in a play I hadn't even been allowed to audition for. The official Vance family narrative was simple. Elena had thrown a massive tantrum over a birthday cake, abandoned her sister in the middle of a delicate mental health crisis, and fled the house purely to punish everyone. That version played at Sunday service. It played at the local salon, and it was embraced by Aunt Helen, who left me that devastating voicemail. I am just deeply disappointed, Elena. Your mother is completely heartbroken. Over a party, sweetheart. Really, I chose not to call her back or defend myself, and I want you to understand why. It wasn't out of weakness. My mother had been perfecting her role as the family's chief narrator for over 50 years. Trying to debate her in front of her own chosen audience would be like playing an away game against a legendary champion. I decided my version of the truth would have to grow quietly out of the soil where no one could shout over it. On the first Sunday of October, a rusted gold sedan pulled into the nursery's gravel lot, and Grandmother Martha slowly climbed out. She was 79, leaning on a wooden cane, with a worn cardboard shoebox cradled under her arm. She surveyed the propagation house like an inspector checking a property boundary, then set the shoebox down on my potting bench. Inside, nestled safely in cedar wood shavings, lay her prized peony tubers, ugly, knobby. Miraculous little things dug straight from her heritage burgundy rose on Elm Street. Her family had kept that specific strain alive since the very year my father was born. "You know what these are?" she stated. It wasn't a question. "Plant them somewhere they will actually be looked at." She patted my cheek with a hand that felt like dry parchment, mentioned she was going to miss her afternoon program, and drove away. I managed to keep my composure until her tail lights vanished down the road. And then I completely broke down. I want you to notice that it took a genuine act of kindness to crack my shell. Being robbed hadn't broken me. Being handed a legacy did. That autumn and winter, my existence shrank to a relentless, clockwork rhythm. I worked the nursery from 5:30 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, hauling soil, watering seedlings, and memorizing Maeve's propagation books like holy scripture. From there, I went straight to my dinner shift at Mabel's Grill, working until 10 at night, carrying heavy plates of meatloaf to truckers who tipped in pocket change and unsolicited advice. Back in the drafty loft, I would read Maeve's Dog, eared books until the words blurred before my eyes. Succession planting, cold tolerance, yield per row foot. I filled a thick spiral notebook with detailed layouts, crossing most of them out, which Maeve assured me was the actual definition of farming. I also wrote to the state university to defer my admission for 1 year. I told them the delay was due to financial constraints. But there was another reason somewhere between the bank robbery and the shoebox of peony tubers. My dream had evolved. Meanwhile, across town, my $8,000 had purchased my sister a semester of school she never attended and a bedroom she refused to leave. Grandmother Martha kept me updated during our Sunday visits, her reports dry and direct. Your sister is resting. Your mother is managing. Your father is painting a porch that stopped peeling back in October. Let me pause right here, my friends, because I know some of you are enduring this exact winter of the soul right now. If you have ever pulled a grueling double shift while the person who took everything from you slept peacefully in your old bedroom, tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story is beginning to sound like an echo of your own life, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button, because the next chapter is where the earth finally begins to shift. Thanksgiving was approaching, and my mother had never once let a major holiday pass without weaponizing it. She called me the Monday before the holiday, her voice warm and inviting, like a freshly baked pie. "We want you at the table, Elena. This silly phase has gone on quite long enough. We are entirely prepared to put your little outburst behind us." I asked her what exactly putting it behind us would require, because with my mother, forgiveness always arrived with a hidden contract. She laid out the terms as if reading from a recipe. I would publicly apologize to Vivienne in front of the entire family for making her academic setback about myself. I would pack up my things and move back into my old bedroom where they could supervise me. I would contribute financially to the household, since I was suddenly so passionate about working. And I would abandon this little gardening distraction before I embarrassed the family name any further. I remember staring out the small loft window at Maeve's empty, frozen-back field while she spoke. 2 acres of dead, frost-covered grass, and feeling an incredibly profound, silent calm wash over me. "And what if I refuse?" I asked. Her tone dropped a fraction of a degree. "We'll worry about your sister, Elena. She is incredibly fragile. You have always been perfectly fine. Honestly, you're the one thing we never have to think about." And there it was again, the family constitution, Article 1. I thanked her for the invitation, told her I had a double shift on Thanksgiving morning, and let the silence hang. "Don't bother showing up for Christmas either," she snapped, hanging up. She always had to have the last word. I stood there with the silent phone pressed to my ear for a long time anyway, listening to the static. I had no idea that night that it would be nearly 10 months before I heard my mother's voice again. And by the time I did, the very ground beneath our feet would be unrecognizable. On Christmas Eve, the nursery was closed, and the loft was so quiet I could hear the small propane heater humming in the corner. I won't sugarcoat this part, because some of you have sat in that exact lonely chair. I wrote my mother a Christmas card. It took me over an hour and 4 different drafts, finally cutting the message down to almost nothing. "Merry Christmas, Mom. I am safe. I am working." But as I sat there with the postage stamp resting on my tongue, I realized with a sudden, painful clarity that tasted like bitter glue. I wasn't writing to my actual mother. I was writing to a mother I had entirely invented in my own mind. A woman who would read those words, soften, and drive over to wrap me in a hug. That woman did not reside at my parents' address. I tucked the card away in the drawer with my 12 unsent invitations. My collection of unspoken truths was growing. Around 8 o'clock, headlights swept across the dark gravel lot. Grandmother Martha let herself into the propagation house, carrying a tin of ginger cookies and offering absolutely no explanation of what she had told my parents to slip away. We ate them sitting next to the seedling heat mats, and she inspected my spiral notebook like a commanding officer reviewing battle plans, which, looking back, she essentially was. Maeve walked in around 9, carrying a parcel wrapped in heavy butcher papers, a massive spool of thick, dark green velvet ribbon. "For your first market stall," she grumbled, daring me to get sentimental. I didn't. But after they both left, I placed that spool of velvet on my windowsill where the card to my fictional mother would have sat, and it looked exactly like what it was, a high-stakes wager. 2 older women had just bet everything on a girl with $900 and a shoebox of dirt. In January, Maeve raised the stakes herself, and the offer she brought came with a formal contract and absolutely no room for sentimentality. During the second week of January, Maeve walked me out into the frozen back field, bundled in boots and an old canvas work coat, and made the proposal that split my life into a definitive before and after. 2 acres of south-facing soil, with a main water line already piped to the old stone trough. "I don't believe in charity," she said before I could even open my mouth. 3 growing seasons. $800 a season, first payment due up front. You provide your own labor, your own seeds, and your own mistakes, all written down in ink with both our signatures so neither of us starts getting soft. $800 was virtually every penny I had left from the bank account. Everything remaining in my copper tea canister was already spoken for trellis netting, ground tarps, and a beat-up hand planter with a loose wheel. I stood on that frozen ground and ran the numbers 3 separate times. The math screamed no, but something deep beneath the calculations whispered now. I signed the lease at her kitchen table that Friday afternoon. 2 acres, $800, and a shoebox of peony tubers. That was my entire inheritance, and as it turned out, it was more than enough. That same week, a letter arrived from the state university asking me to confirm my deferred enrollment. I let the deadline pass on purpose. I want to be honest, it terrified me far more than leaving my parents' house had. When I left home, I had a destination to walk toward. This time, I was stepping completely off the edge of my own map. 18 years old with no college degree, no family support, and no backup plan, farming land I didn't even own. But you cannot cultivate a harvest with 1 foot left outside the field. That February, as soon as the soil began to thaw, I nestled grandmother Martha's prized tubers into trays of damp moss to coax them awake. The very first pale green shoots broke through the soil on the exact morning the local gossip would have deemed me foolish. But spring extracted a heavy tax from my confidence almost immediately. I had started my anemones and sweet peas early, planting rows of them in late April because the 10-day weather forecast looked promising and I wanted a head start on the Mother's Day rush. Then, a sudden frost swept down from the hills on a clear, windless night. The kind of freezing air that doesn't issue a warning, but simply arrives and claims its territory. I walked the rows at sunrise, my breath misting in the cold air, staring at $400 worth of delicate seedlings reduced to wet black mush. I had known better. Maeve's manuals had explicitly warned me, and Maeve herself had told me so. I had heard the warning and gambled anyway, because hope is an incredibly beautiful liar. I allowed myself exactly 1 hour to feel completely sick about it, sitting on an upturned wooden crate at the edge of the ruined row. Then, I pulled out my notebook and recorded the date, the low temperature, and the lesson. Regret doesn't compost into anything useful, but data does. Maeve walked out around 7, surveyed the devastation with her hands buried deep in her pockets, and delivered the eulogy. A hard frost isn't a life sentence, kid. It's just tuition. We cleared the beds and replanted. I shifted my focus to more resilient varieties. Zinnias, cosmos sunflowers, and snapdragons tucked under low protective tunnels. And I guarded those heritage peonies in their propagation trays like a high security ward, because those weren't just plants. They were the only heirloom anyone had ever handed me. By the final week of May, the field had transformed from a dry grid into lush, vibrant green rows so straight that Maeve actually grunted in approval, which, coming from Maeve, was equivalent to a ticker tape parade. By the first Saturday of June, I faced a problem I had never factored into my spiral notebook: buckets upon buckets of perfect, freshly cut, gorgeous flowers, and absolutely nowhere to sell them. The Blackwood Growers Market rented an 8-foot wooden stall for $12 a Saturday. I claimed the space sandwiched between a local honey vendor and a woman selling organic soaps. I set up a borrowed card table, decorated it with Maeve's dark green velvet ribbon, and displayed a chalkboard I had hand-lettered at midnight Vance petals. Mixed bouquets, $12. Zinnias like stained glass, cosmos, snapdragons, and wild blue cornflowers, I had wrapped 30 bouquets in brown butcher paper, privately terrified that I would be walking home with 29 of them. My very first customer was a retired schoolteacher who bought 2 arrangements and remarked that no one had offered real, field-grown flowers at this market in decades. By 10:30, I was frantically restocking from the reserve buckets beneath the table. By noon, I had completely sold out. I stood there with $310 in an old tin box, mostly in small, crumpled bills, my cheeks aching from holding a smile they weren't accustomed to. I won't pretend $310 is a fortune. It was less than I made working a week of double shifts at the grill, but every single dollar in that box had been pulled directly from soil I had leased with my own signature. And money earned that way carries a very different weight. News travels fast in a close, knit place like Blackwood. 2 prominent church ladies from my mother's congregation stopped by, recognized me, and suddenly became intensely interested in smelling my sweet peas. Before the market had even closed, my phone buzzed with a notification from a phone number I hadn't seen since Thanksgiving. A single text a market stall. Congratulations. That was the entire message. If you have ever had a mother like mine, you know the exact patronizing frequency of that tone. Congratulations, delivered the way you might say, "Oh, bless your heart." I read it twice, slipped the phone into the tin box with the bills, and sold my last 3 bouquets. I never sent a reply. The field did all the talking for me that summer. In July, a young bride named Beatrice stopped at my table, grew tearful over the snapdragons, and asked if I designed weddings. I said yes with the absolute confidence of someone who had never styled a wedding in her life. A $900 budget for late August, a bridal bouquet, 5 table arrangements, and an arbor piece. I spent 2 weeks reading, and 1 entirely sleepless night floating stems in every bucket Maeve owned, transporting them in a cooler I had rigged out of an old chest freezer box filled with bags of ice. And late August was exactly when Grandmother Martha's peonies finally bloomed. The deep burgundy petals unfurled into massive, velvety saucers of impossible crimson, and I built Beatrice's bouquet around 9 of those spectacular flowers. At the reception, 3 separate guests asked the event staff who had designed the florals. The coordinator pointed across the pavilion at me. "The peony girl," she said, and the moniker stuck the way only accidental names do. Beatrice's mother booked her autumn anniversary party on the spot. 2 of the bridesmaids requested cards I didn't even have yet, so I wrote my phone number on brown butcher paper with a floral crayon, and Maeve laughed all the way home. Something had fundamentally shifted, and I could feel the change the way you sense a storm rolling in through a closed window. The market table was no longer just a table. It was growing into something that required an identity. By Labor Day weekend, it had one. My closest friend, Chloe Finch, had been showing up on Saturdays since June, initially to gossip, but eventually for actual pay. She was the one who sanded down an old piece of barn wood, painted Vance petals across it in clean cream, white, and screwed it to the wooden market stall before I could even cast a vote. Vance petals. My family name, written in paint out in the open. I stood there feeling completely exposed, which tells you everything you need to know about the environment I was raised in. By September, the operation resembled an actual business, if you looked at it with a little generosity. 25 residential subscription customers received a hand-wrapped bouquet every Friday afternoon. Peak market Saturdays cleared over $500. Photos of Beatrice's wedding were circulating among every engaged girl in the county. I paid Maeve for my second lease season in full, early, and in cash, mostly just to watch her try to suppress a proud smile. She accepted the money and grumbled that my trellis rows were crooked, which in Maeve's language meant she was incredibly proud of me. But here is what I want you to notice, because it is crucial for what happened next. I still worked from the very back of the stall. Chloe was the one who chatted with the customers. I kept my hat brim pulled low and my hands busy. Some habits are deeply structural. Being seen still felt like stepping into a room I had no right to enter. Meanwhile, Grandmother Martha's Sunday dispatches kept coming. Vivienne had abandoned an online design course in June and retreated into absolute silence. My mother had stopped mentioning my name entirely at church, which Martha noted was a highly effective form of communication. The entire town was doing the math my mother could no longer cover up. A girl who supposedly ran away over a petty birthday tantrum doesn't typically reappear a year later with an active business, a prominent sign, and a waiting list of clients. And then, on the Tuesday following Labor Day, a number I didn't recognize flashed on my screen, the county newspaper. My very first instinct was to tell the reporter no. Her name was Rachel Sterling, and she authored the Blackwood Herald's Soil and Seed column. Someone at the growers' market had tipped her off. I highly suspected the organic soap vendor, who viewed my life as her personal drama series. Rachel wanted to write a feature profile, a young local grower, heritage peonies, the whole narrative. My mouth blurted out, "Oh, no thank you." Before my brain could even process it, the knee-jerk reaction of a girl trained since childhood to hand the microphone down the table to someone else. I mentioned the call to Maeve that evening, expecting her to agree, since Maeve viewed media attention the way she viewed spider mites. Instead, she set her coffee mug down with a sharp click. "Elena, for an entire year. Other people have been writing your story at every single dinner table in this county, and you handed them the pen because keeping quiet felt like polite manners." She pushed the mug aside. "If you hide your face, they will keep writing your life for you. That reporter is offering to hand the pen back. Take it." I called Rachel back the next morning. She arrived on Thursday with a photographer, spent 2 hours walking my cultivated rows, and asked me questions no one in my family had ever bothered to ask. Why peonies? Why flowers at all? What had the hard frost taught me? What did that painted wooden sign represent? When the photographer searched for the perfect backdrop, I did the bravest thing I had done since that cold September night with my 2 canvas bags. I didn't shield myself behind an armload of foliage or pull Chloe into the shot. I stood completely alone, dead center in the middle of my deep burgundy peony row, wearing my soiled work apron with dirt beneath my fingernails, and looked directly into the camera lens. The feature ran the following Thursday, occupying the front page of the lifestyle section. By noon that day, my mother had read every word. By that evening, so had every single person she had ever handed her version of the story to. The headline read, "The 18-year, old cultivating Vance petals." There was the vibrant field, the hand-painted sign, the stunning burgundy flowers, and me, staring back at the camera like a person who had every right to occupy space in a photograph. Rachel had written a clean, warm profile, the nursery job at 14, the leased 2 acres, the devastating spring frost, the beautiful wedding, and the heirloom tubers preserved by my grandmother. She didn't mention my parents even once, which in Blackwood spoke louder than any accusation she could have printed. The town did the calculations in a single sitting. Women I had never met joined my weekly subscription list, leaving notes like, "So incredibly proud of you, sweetheart." The church ladies who had once hovered over my sweet peas now stopped by my market stall to tell me how delighted my grandmother must be. My mother's elaborate narrative, the tantrum, the cake, the selfish abandonment, folded quietly, the way a lie always collapses when a physical photograph walks into the room. She called me Friday morning. No greeting. "You put our private family business in the local newspaper, Elena." I pointed out that the article didn't mention our family at all. "Exactly," she whispered, her voice trembling in a way I had never heard before. "Everyone at the pharmacy and at church is asking your sister what she is doing with her life now. Do you have any idea what that does to her? Of course you don't. You have always been perfectly fine. You have absolutely no concept of what she goes through." I looked out across 2 acres of solid, visible proof and said quietly, "You're right, Mom. I don't." And then, for the first time in my entire life, I hung up the phone first. Vivienne, for her part, sent no messages, no texts, no updates through grandmother Martha. In a household where emotions were typically broadcast at maximum volume, her silence was a brand new instrument. I should have wondered what kind of song she was tuning up to play, because the next call arrived from my grandmother with a heavy demand. Grandmother Martha was turning 80 at the end of September, and she called me herself, which she almost never did, viewing telephones as a passing gimmick. "They are trying to plan my birthday," she announced. "Helen wants to rent the church hall. Your mother wants to host it at her house so she can control the room." She paused, and I could hear the sharp satisfaction in her voice. "I told them I have sat in both of those suffocating rooms for 80 years. I want my celebration in your field, in the middle of something honest. I already announced it to the entire family so no one can wriggle out of it." I sat down on an upturned crate, my chest tightening. My field. 30 advance relatives, including 2 parents and a sister I had not set eyes on in a year, standing in the very center of everything I had built out of the wreckage they had handed me. "Grandma," I said, "Mom will never show up." "She'll show up," Martha replied, her voice as flat as a griddle, skipping her own mother's 80th, after that newspaper article, in front of the whole town. "Your mother would rather drink poison. That is exactly why I said it there. Sweetie, it's my birthday. I am allowed one genuine present. I choose myself." She wanted the truth in the room, and she wanted it planted where no one could shout over it. "Now, my friends, before we step into that field together, I want to ask you honestly in the comments below, would you have allowed them to come? Because I came very close to saying no. I stood in my peony rose for an hour after that call, arguing with the flowers. If this were your life, the canceled birthday, the stolen savings, the year of total silence, tell me what you would have done. And if you are new to their secret stories, subscribe now, because a canceled 18th birthday is about to come full circle at an 80th, 1 week before the party my mother called. She had a small favor to ask. 2 weeks after I had hung up on her, she rang and opened with simple logistics, acting as though nothing had ever happened. How many chairs would there be? Was there enough shade? Should Helen bring her lemon tarts? Then, casually, the way you might slip a blade into a picnic basket, she delivered the real pitch. "One minor thing, sweetheart. In the future, when people ask about the flower farm, and they will, it would mean the absolute world to us if you would present it as a collective family project. Because honestly, if you think about it, that's what it is. You learned your incredible work ethic under our roof." I actually laughed aloud. A short, sharp sound I couldn't suppress. She pressed on, her voice sweetening the way it always did when the manipulation was the entire point of the call. "And we really think it would be incredibly healing. Dr. Sterling thinks it would be healing for Vivienne to have a tangible role there. Events, party styling, that sort of thing. She has such an incredible eye for aesthetics. It doesn't have to be anything formal on Sunday. But if anyone asks, you could just mention that Vivienne is handling the event coordination for Vance Petals. She really needs a victory right now, Elena. You have so many of them now. And there it was, the emergency room's billing department, open for business once again. My birthday celebration, my life savings, and now the demand had simply scaled up with my harvest. My name, my leased land, and my year of grueling double shifts repackaged as a family project, with my sister inserted into the narrative like a transplant my body was expected to accept without rejecting. "No, Mom," I said, my voice as calm as I could possibly make it, which by that point was incredibly calm. The farm isn't an apology, and it isn't a stage prop. But you are all more than welcome to attend on Sunday as guests. I would genuinely love to have you there. The silence on the line stretched out, heavy and tense. "Fine," she said sharply and hung up. I thought I had successfully closed the door on the ambush. Looking back, I had only locked the front door. The celebration took place on the last Sunday of September, almost exactly 1 year to the week since I had carried my canvas duffel bags down my parents' staircase. On Saturday, we began setting up. Chloe and Maeve hauled the long wooden tables into the center aisle between the peony rows, and I strung warm fairy lights through the fence posts and the young oak tree by the wooden gate. Fairy lights, the exact kind I had once envisioned for a backyard on Elm Street. And yes, I noticed, and yes, I hung them anyway. We cut 200 magnificent stems of Martha's heritage, burgundy peonies, and stood them in heavy zinc buckets running down the center of the tables. The field was at its absolute peak that late autumn flush when flowers burn brightest right before the first hard frost, almost as if they know their time is short. Mid-afternoon, a familiar truck rumbled slowly up the dirt lane my father, arriving alone with 5 wooden folding chairs from the church basement. We hadn't stood face to face in a year. He climbed out of the cab, stared down the long, lush green rows for a very long moment, and said, "The soil drains well here. That's a love letter," in my father's silent vocabulary. That was a profound confession. We set up the chairs together for an hour, mostly in silence. Twice he stopped, straightened his back, and half turned toward me with his mouth open to speak, but both times he folded whatever he wanted to say back up and tucked it away, just like the $80 in crumpled bills. At the gate, as he was leaving, he tried one last time, managing only, "Your grandmother is incredibly proud of you, Elena." Then he drove back toward the house, where my mother was undoubtedly ironing the outfits and editing the family script. Chloe found me watching his taillights disappear, ready for tomorrow. She asked softly. "No," I replied, but set out the coffee urn anyway. The following afternoon, 31 members of my family walked into my field. Every single one of them showed up, even her, especially her. They arrived up the dirt lane in a slow caravan of sensible family sedans, and I watched 31 people confront my reality for the very first time. You could see the impact land on each face at the gate. The aunts falling silent mid-sentence, the cousins pulling out their phones. Uncle Julian actually removing his cap in respect. Late September had dressed the field far better than I ever could have. 200 burgundy peonies ran down the long tables, the afternoon light shifting to a rich amber, the rose burning deep crimson out to the property boundary. Grandmother Martha arrived like a visiting dignitary, taking one slow lap down the center aisle, resting on Helen's arm before installing herself at the head table where she could personally supervise both the dessert and the truth. My mother stepped out of her car wearing her finest Sunday dress, and I will give her this, she never once let her composure slip. She toured the tables like a gracious hostess, straightening a jar here, adjusting a floral bucket there, telling Aunt Carol, "Oh, we always knew Elena had the green thumb. She inherits it from my side of the family, you know. I grew beautiful things before the girls were born. It was as smooth as icing. A year of bitter accusations and abandonment paved in a single afternoon into we always knew. I chose to let it slide. The field didn't require me to fight its battles." Vivienne arrived last, 40 minutes late, wearing a dress far too formal for folding chairs, her hair styled like protective armor. She hugged Grandmother Martha for the family photo, accepted a glass of lemonade she didn't drink, and then drifted along the perimeter of the field alone, studying my life like an auditor reviewing a set of books. I watched her pause at the gate where Chloe's wooden sign hung, Vance Petals, painted in clean cream white, and stand in front of it, completely motionless, for far longer than anyone normally looks at a sign. Helen materialized at my elbow, holding a plate of lemon tarts and a softened expression. "Are you doing all right?" she asked. It was the first question she had asked me in a year that didn't carry an accusation. "Ask me when the sun goes down," I replied. Just before the toasts began, I went to clip a few final stems for the cake table and found my mother standing completely alone at the far end of the burgundy peony row, where the chatter of the party faded into the hum of the bees. She didn't hear me approaching. She was touching one of the massive, velvety blooms with 2 fingertips, gently, the way you might touch a sleeping infant or a stove you suspect is still hot. Her face had softened into an expression I had never once been invited to see. "We used to have rows exactly like this," she murmured, speaking more to the flowers than to me. "Behind our old house on Maple Lane, I started an entire tray of seeds the spring I turned 19. Asters, pansies. I kept a detailed notebook. I stood perfectly still, the way you do when you don't want to startle a wild animal. And then my mother got sick, and it took 2 long years start to finish, and I was the one who had to handle everything. Your father couldn't cope with the hospitals, so it fell on me. Every single day before work and after." Her fingers drifted away from the pedal. "My brother Julian got the family wood shop when she passed. You know. Everyone said he had been through so much and needed the support. My tray of seeds simply dried up on the windowsill. No one watered them. Everyone was too busy telling Julian how strong he was going to have to be. For the space of one single breath, standing in the row my own hands had cultivated, I saw her clearly. A young girl with a notebook, ground down by the exact same family machinery 30 years before me. My throat tightened. I almost reached out. I almost said, "Mom, I understand." That was the closest we had ever come in my entire life. But then she sensed my presence, her posture instantly stiffened, and the vulnerability vanished from her face like a light being switched off in a farmhouse window. "That's simply life, Elena," she said briskly, already turning her back on the row. "The strong ones are meant to carry the weight. That is what love actually is." She walked back toward the gathering. I stood in the quiet row, leaving the silence to the bees, until the sound of a spoon ringing against a glass began to echo across the field. Grandmother Martha stood up without any assistance, a detail she explicitly wanted noted, and raised her glass of lemonade to the field. 80 years, she announced, and I have celebrated my birthdays in cramped kitchens, drafty church halls, and one highly memorable year in a hospital room. This is the very first celebration I have ever had in the center of something completely honest. She gestured toward the buckets of burgundy peonies on the tables. My mother cultivated this bloom. I grew it the year your father was born and every year since. And last autumn, I handed those tubers to my granddaughter. because a flower like this requires hands that are willing to show up in the hard frost. And I recognize hard-working hands when I see them. She looked directly at me, her chin trembling slightly, though her voice remained absolutely solid. This flower never had an official name, so today, in front of all these witnesses, I am naming it so it sticks. Martha's velvet, grown by Elena Vance on Elena Vance's own land. This field is the most honest thing this family has managed to grow in 30 years. The applause rose warm and genuine, and 31 faces turned to look at me. For the first time in my entire existence, I stood in the light and did not search for the nearest exit. And that was the exact moment my mother stood up from her chair, her glass raised high, her smile wide, riding the wave of applause like a seasoned politician catching a departing train. And we have one more piece of wonderful news to share while we are all gathered together. Her voice carried clearly to the edge of the property. You have all read about our brilliant Elena in the newspaper. Well, Vance Padels is officially becoming a true family enterprise. Vivienne, darling. Stand up beside her, my sister rose slowly, her glass shaking visibly. Vivienne is going to be managing all of our events and styled parties here at the estate. Both of our wonderful girls, working side by side. We are just so incredibly proud of our girls. The polite clapping started up again. Hesitant and uncertain, the way a crowd applauds when they sense something is deeply wrong, but no one wants to be the first to call it out. Down the table, Aunt Helen's eyes locked onto mine, silently asking the question. I didn't raise my voice. I have replayed that moment countless times over the last 11 years, and I am absolutely certain of that. A lifetime of quiet compliance keeps you steady even when your ears are ringing. I looked at my mother across the long table, with 31 relatives seated between us, and said, "That isn't true, Mom, and it isn't going to happen." It was as simple and direct as a weather report. The hesitant applause died instantly. My mother's smile remained frozen in place, but behind her eyes, the gears were turning frantically as she opened her mouth to smooth over the moment. She was always master of public damage control, but she never got the chance. Vivienne's glass slammed down onto the table, and my sister let out a sound I had never heard from her before. A desperate, broken laugh. "Of course it isn't true," she cried, her voice climbing. "Nothing about us is true!" You want to clap for the Vance girls. You want to hear the real story about the girls. Her voice reached a pitch that silenced the entire field. "It was supposed to be me. Everything was always supposed to be about me. That was the deal. That was our entire arrangement." She spun toward the gathered relatives like a wild force. You think she built this beautiful place alone? Do you know they canceled her 18th birthday because I wept? Canceled her party, kept the cake, and put my name on it instead. My name! I ate her birthday cake. She was crying hysterically now, her makeup running down her cheeks. 22 years of carefully curated fragility evaporating like mist. "And the money! Oh, you should all know about the money!" They took her savings. $8,000 of her hard-earned money from her paychecks, and poured it into my Portland Styling Academy. And I threw it away in 11 days, just like I throw everything away. My mother was on her feet, pleading in her emergency room voice. "Vivienne, sweetheart, please, you aren't well." But Vivienne spun around, her arm flailing, and her hand caught the heavy zinc bucket at the head table. It tipped over in slow motion. Water flooded across the white linen tablecloth. 24 stems of Martha's velvet rolled out onto the green grass, deep burgundy on bright green, in front of our entire family. In the absolute, suffocating silence that followed, Aunt Helen stood up, her face completely pale. She looked directly at my mother and said, You told us she walked out over a childish tantrum. What remains clearest in my memory of the next minute is the profound silence. A whole field of people frozen in place. Maeve stood by the coffee urn with her arms crossed, watching my mother the way an eagle watches a snake. Vivienne sobbed quietly into her palms, looking smaller and more hollow than I had ever seen her. And my mother knelt on the grass in her fine Sunday dress, gathering the fallen peonies into her arms one by one, her hands desperately seeking a task while her entire empire crumbled around her. Then she looked up at me, whispering low, meant only for the two of us while the rest of the family held their breath. "Fix this, Elena. You can fix this. Just tell them the birthday party was a big misunderstanding. Tell them we helped you finance this farm. We are your parents. It's barely even a lie. Just give your sister the event job, that's all. That's all it takes, and we can put this family back together. You can finally come back home. Sunday dinners, your old room, your family. You can finally come home, sweetheart. And here is the confession I need you to hear. I wanted it. 11 years later, I can admit that honestly. Every wounded 7-year-old cell in my body wanted to say yes, because it was the ultimate prize. Held out to me in the open air at last, my mother, begging me to return. All I had to do was pay the price. The exact same currency as always shrink the truth. Surrender my narrative, share my name on the sign, and fade into the background at my own table once again. I looked down at her, her arms overflowing with my grandmother's ruined flowers. I heard the silence of the field behind me, full of people who were finally, truly seeing the reality. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice as level as a foundation. "I have always been perfectly fine on my own. You made sure I had plenty of practice." Her arms tightened around the stems. "But I am not buying my seat at your table. Not with the truth. Not with this farm. Not with myself. You are both welcome here as guests any Sunday you wish. That is my only offer. It doesn't go on sale." My mother stood up slowly, clutching the peonies. For a brief second, I thought, even then, I hope. But she laid the broken flowers on the table like evidence, took Vivienne by the hand, and walked out of my field without looking back. She never has. The party didn't so much end as slowly exhale. Grandmother Martha announced to no one in particular that it was the absolute best birthday she had celebrated in 80 years, and she would appreciate it if no one argued with her, which somehow gave the remaining relatives permission to stay for another hour. Aunt Helen sliced the cake with trembling hands, looking at me the entire time like a woman reading a vital document she had misfiled years ago. But my father stood by the wooden gate for a long time after my mother's car had departed. He had ridden over with Uncle Julian, I realized later, specifically so he wouldn't have to drive back with her. When I brought him his jacket, he spun his cap in his hands like a steering wheel. "I should have spoken up on your birthday," he muttered to the gravel. "I've been staying quiet for 20 years, Elena. Turns out, saying nothing is the loudest thing I ever did." I looked at him and said, "I know, Dad. I didn't say it's okay. I was entirely finished saying that." He gave a quiet nod, climbed into Julian's truck, and returned to the household he had chosen to remain in every single day of my life, because he was who he was. But starting that November, the letters began to arrive. One every month, written in his jagged handwriting, just 4 lines at a time. "Saw some beautiful lavender at the feed store, thought of you. The ground froze early this season. Dad." I kept every single one of them. When the final tail lights vanished down the lane, Maeve and Chloe began stacking the wooden chairs, while Martha sat like a sentinel over the empty dessert plate. I walked out alone to the far end of the burgundy peony row. with the evening air rolling in cold and deep blue. A single stem lay snapped where the bucket had been overturned. I picked it up, standing in the dark field that was entirely mine, and finally understood the last truth, the one I had been dancing around all year. I had stopped paying my family's rent a year ago, but some part of me had still been waiting for the landlord to drive by, admire the garden, and ask me to come back. That hope was officially gone. It had walked out of the field on its own 2 feet. Grandmother Martha's voice drifted down the quiet rows behind me, instructing Chloe to place the broken bloom in a vase. "A cut flower isn't a dead flower," she called out. "Someone bring that inside. Here is where everything finally settled in the simple, quiet mathematics of the aftermath. Our family did fracture exactly the way the local gossip still describes it. Aunt Helen came to the farm the following weekend, bringing a batch of lemon tarts and a written apology she had prepared by hand so she wouldn't lose her nerve. She read it to me at the potting bench, and we both politely pretended Maeve wasn't listening from the seed room. Our Sunday dinners moved to Grandmother Martha's cozy kitchen on Elm Street. Martha, Helen, Chloe most of the time, and me smelling of fresh soil and green leaves. No one at that table has ever once asked me to make myself smaller. My mother attempted to spin a new version of the story for a while Vivienne was simply exhausted. Elena is just going through a dramatic phase. You know how young women can be. But a narrative requires an audience to survive, and her listeners slowly moved their focus to the other side of the aisle, in some cases, quite literally. She still lives just 2 miles down the road. We have not spoken a single word since she walked out of my field, and I have made my peace with the very real possibility that we never will. Peace was only ever available at a price I refused to pay. My father continues to write his 4 lines a month, slipping a $20 bill into my Christmas card like contraband, loving me from behind the high fence he built around himself. I have stopped grading his efforts. It is simply what he has to offer. And Vivienne, late one night this past winter, my phone lit up with the first words my sister had sent me in over a year. The flowers were beautiful. That was all. No apology, no explanation. When I passed her in the grocery aisle this March, she kept her eyes fixed on her shoes. I heard she moved in with a friend in Portland and took a job at a local garden center, of all places on this earth. I never replied to her text, but I never deleted it either. Some seeds you simply leave in the packet, waiting to see how you feel when the spring ground thaws. The farm continued to be a farm, which is the quiet, beautiful miracle of the land. Our 3rd season sold out its subscriptions by April. Martha's Velvet went into the ground in May, 300 tubers strong. Every single one descended from that original cardboard shoebox. And in June, a young girl named Tessa started showing up at the gate. 14, awkward, quiet, and all elbows. The exact kind of kid who wins regional ribbons that no one drives to see. Her family needed her to be absolutely no trouble, and Tessa was doing her best to oblige. I recognized the species instantly. I pay her actual fair wages. I make her read her invoices out loud and looking me straight in the eye, and the first time she managed to do it without offering an apology, I gave her a raise on the spot. Last week, I caught her bossing a customer's noisy kid away from the delicate seedling trays, her hands on her hips, occupying her entire space in the doorway. I had to go step into the cooler for a minute to compose myself. That is the crop I am proudest of, if you want the honest truth, not the peonies. A young girl learning 3 years earlier than I did that she is fully allowed to send a bill for what she gives, and that anyone who only loves her when she is invisible isn't family. They are just a landlord with her childhood photos hanging on their walls. If there is one truth I could carve into a wooden sign and nail up where every low-maintenance girl could read it, it is this: love you have to earn by disappearing isn't love at all. It is rent. And the day you finally stop paying it is the day you discover who was truly your family and who was simply collecting the payment. That is my story: a canceled birthday, a cardboard box of peony tubers, 2 acres of leased land, and a single signature. If you have been the strong one at your family's table, I hope you plant something of your own this year and stand proudly where you can be seen. Tell me in the comments what you would have said in that field. And if this story stayed with you, make sure to subscribe to their secret stories. Next week, another woman tells the whole truth calmly, all the way to the end.